Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we'll walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 37. These are issues that anyone doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with. And each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 37, the top 3 issues are the text and grammar and meaning of verse 20, the text of verse 28, and the text and meaning of verse 35b. The first of our top exegetical issues in Psalm 37 is the text, grammar, and meaning of verse 20. The King James Version reads, "But the wicked shall perish, and the enemies of the Lord shall be as the fat of lambs. They shall consume, into smoke they shall consume away." The phrase, "as the fat of lambs," has been rendered in different ways. For example, the ESV says, "The enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures." And the REB says that they will go up in smoke like fuel in a furnace. The traditional Hebrew text behind most modern translations reads kikar karim. The adjective yakar means precious, which in this case seems to refer to the most precious things or ones belonging to the karim. It is rather more difficult to decide what karim means in the context. One reading, well attested in antiquity and among medieval Jewish commentators, is to take karim as lambs, coming from the common noun kar, a young ram for the slaughter, according to Halot. In this case, interpreters usually understand the precious thing to refer to the fat of the lambs who are sacrificed. The Psalms Targum paraphrases, "As the glory of sheep that in the beginning are fattened, and at the end they are slaughtered, even so shall the wicked come to an end, and they shall be destroyed in the smoke of Gehenna." A Psalms commentary from Qumran 4Q 171 interprets this verse similarly. "Whoever loves the Lord will be like precious lambs." Its interpretation concerns who will be the chiefs and princes over the whole congregation, like shepherds of ewes in among their flocks. This reading makes good sense of the reference to smoke at the end of Psalm 37:20. And it also finds parallels elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, where the slaughter of the Lord's enemies is pictured as animal sacrifices, such as Isaiah 34:6. Nevertheless, this image of enemies as sacrifices to be slaughtered is not evident anywhere else in Psalm 37 and seems rather out of place. The main idea in the verse seems to be that the wicked are transient, here 1 minute and gone the next, and the fat of lambs burning on a sacrificial altar does not naturally communicate that idea. A second interpretation of karim comes from the less common word kar, meaning pasture. The ESV, for example, says, "But the wicked will perish. The enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures." This meaning for kar is evident in Psalm 65:14. "The meadows, karim, clothe themselves with flocks. The valleys deck themselves with grain," according to the NRSV. So also in Isaiah 30:23, "On that day your cattle will graze in broad pastures," or kar. If karim refers to pastures, then the precious thing probably refers to some glorious feature of the pastures. For example, flowers. The NIV, for example, says, "Though the Lord's enemies are like the flowers of the field." This interpretation fits the overall context of the verse very well, since flowers are a well-known image for transitoriness. In Isaiah 40, verse 8, we read, "The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever." Similarly, in Psalm 103:15-16, "As mortals, their days are like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field, for the wind passes over it and it is gone, and its place knows it no more." This idea also nicely parallels other similes from the natural world in Psalm 37. Verse 35 refers to the wicked as flourishing trees who unexpectedly disappear, And verse 2 says of the wicked, they will soon fade like grass and wither like the green herb. Verse 2 in particular is important because verses 1 to 2 and verse 20 form the boundaries of the first half of the psalm. Thus, if verse 20 is interpreted as the fading of the flowers of the field, we have here an inclusio with the same combination of parallel imagery of grass and flowers as in the Isaiah 40 verse 8 and Psalm 103 examples. The biggest problem with reading this expression as the flowers of pastures is the reference to smoke later in the verse. If the expected image is of flowers fading away with wind and or time, the smoke seems very much out of place. One could explain this as an image of a grass fire where the flowers are consumed in smoke. But this does not seem particularly compelling. More plausibly, the smoke could be interpreted as a different image entirely, since smoke is frequently used in the Hebrew Bible as a metaphor for transitoriness, because it is quickly swept away. For example, Hosea 13:3. This explanation seems very likely, especially if we read like smoke here, following many Hebrew manuscripts, including 4Q 171, instead of in smoke of the traditional Masoretic text. Thus, we prefer to read Kikar Karim as like the precious flowers of the pastures. One final conjectural emendation is to read the expression as Kikod Kurim, like the burning of ovens. For example, the REB says, but the wicked will perish. The enemies of the Lord, like fuel in a furnace, will go up in smoke. The word Yokod means burning or conflagration, and it's graphically very similar to Yakar. And the word Kur means a little smelting furnace, according to Helot. This reading could claim support from the Qumran commentary 4Q 171, which reads Kurim with a vowel letter Vav. But this could rather be a phonological variant for Karim, and the commentary cited above implies that the author interprets the word as referring to lambs. Furthermore, 4Q 171 reads Yakar with a resh like the MT rather than Yakod. This emendation requires only slight changes to the Hebrew text and makes good sense of the smoke imagery later in the verse. And Yakad is found in parallel with smoke in Isaiah 65:5. But this emendation lacks ancient support and does not seem preferable. Thus, we conclude that the earliest recoverable form of the text is probably Kikar Karim, which we read as like the precious flowers of the pastures. These flowers of the field, according to the NIV, despite their beauty, quickly come to an end. This explanation coheres best with the surrounding imagery for the transience of the wicked in this verse and the rest of the psalm. The point is that though the wicked appear to flourish for a moment, their demise is imminent. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue in Psalm 37 is the text of verse 28. In the ESV, this verse is translated as, "For the Lord loves justice. He will not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever, but the children of the wicked shall be cut off." The phrase translated "they are preserved forever" is the Hebrew "le'olam nishmaru" of the Masoretic text. Other translators choose to read a different Hebrew text. The NJB, for example, adopts as its Hebrew text "avalim le'olam nishmadu," which translates as "evildoers will perish eternally." The BDS appears to adopt a slightly different Hebrew text, "avalim nishmadu," or perhaps "avalim nitzmatu," which it translates as "mais les malfaisants seront supprimés," but the evildoers will be eliminated. Most modern translations follow the MT reading "le'olam nishmaru," which the ESV translates as "they are preserved forever." This is the reading of the medieval Hebrew manuscript tradition, and it's supported by the Peshitta, Jerome's translation from the Hebrew, and the Psalms Targum. Some have claimed support from the Qumran Psalms commentary 4Q 171 and the Septuagint, but as we will see, this is problematic. This MT reading follows nicely from the previous verse about the Lord's not forsaking his saints, and the fronted Zera Rashaim, the children of the wicked, the following line, could function well as a marked topic shift. But there are several major problems with the MT reading. First of all, our two oldest textual witnesses disagree with the MT here. While 4Q 171 has occasionally been misread as supporting Nishmaru, it probably read Nishmadu with a dalit instead. The letter in question is partially damaged, but close inspection of the relevant images makes it fairly clear that the manuscript reads a dalit, and most editors who have published on the manuscript agree. The situation is similarly problematic for the Septuagint. In his 1931 edition of the Greek Psalms, Ralphs printed the text «Es tonaiona phulachthe sontai, anamoi de ekdiochthe sontai». They shall be kept safe forever, but the lawless shall be chased away, according to Netz. But this seems to be a double translation of the Hebrew text. The first part, they shall be kept safe forever, is not found in Ralph's 2110, one of the oldest and most important Psalms manuscripts, and it seems to have been added at a later time to make the Greek text more like the MT. The second part, but the lawless shall be chased away, seems to preserve the original Greek translation and corresponds to a different Hebrew text. Either avalim nishmadu or avalim nitzmatu. Thus, while the majority of the Greek tradition also reflects an early harmonization towards the MT, the earliest form of the Greek text attests to a significant variant that's probably also related to the reading in 4Q 171. In addition to contrary ancient witnesses, the MT reading Le'olam Nishmaru is also problematic in other ways. The MT seems to badly distort the original poetic structure of the psalm. The MT reading and accentuation suggests that 28C is more closely related to 28A to B than to the following line 28D, grouping them all into a single extra long verse. In doing so, it also obscures the characteristic structuring of the psalm into distinct sections forming an alphabetic acrostic. In Psalm 37, almost every section contains two verses, and each section begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet succeeding in alphabetical order. Thus, the structure of the psalm here clearly leads us instead to expect a new section starting at 28C, and the first letter of the first word should be Ayin rather than the Lamed of Le'olam. Some have argued that the reading Utshuat at the beginning of the Tav section in verse 39 means that the expected first letter for the acrostic could be preceded by another letter. But this example is textually dubious. Clearly, there is something problematic with the MT reading, and ancient sources provide viable alternatives. Because of this, some modern translations follow a different Hebrew text. BHS suggests reconstructing Avalim Le'olam Nishmadu, which the NJB translates evildoers will perish eternally. In support of this, our oldest Hebrew witness, 4Q 171, seems to read Nishmadu with the support of the Old Greek translation, and the previous word seems to have ended with Lamed, followed by a final mem. On this reading, verse 28c is about the fate of the wicked in parallel with verse 28d, and the Ayin section indeed begins with the expected Ayin. Further support for this reading can be found in verse 38, where the roots shamad and karat are similarly used in parallel in reference to the destruction of the wicked. The main problem with this reading is the reconstruction of Avalim Le'olam. This portion of 4Q 171 is damaged, so we cannot know for sure what it read at this point. And the Old Greek translation does not have any equivalent for Le'olam, so there is no sure ancient support for this reading. Additionally, it seems too much of a coincidence that all of our surviving witnesses attest only Le'olam or Avalim, but never both. This would mean that one or more scribes omitted the one, and one or more other scribes independently omitted the other. A much simpler explanation commends itself, which we prefer here. We treat Avalim and Le'olam as variants for the same word, leading to the Hebrew text behind the Old Greek translation, namely Avalim Nishmadu, or perhaps Avalim Nitzmatu. The BDS attests to this reading with its translation, Mais les malfaisants seront supprimés, but the evildoers will be terminated. This view shares all the benefits of the preceding view, but without the liabilities. It restores the original poetic structure of the psalm and enjoys the support of the oldest witnesses. It retains the close parallel with verse 38. It also has the benefit of most easily being able to explain the origin of the other variant. If Nishmadu, they will be destroyed, was first misread as Nishmaru, they will be protected, then it would only be natural for Avalim, evildoers, to be misread as the common expression Olam or Le'olam, forever. If read as Olam, the text would then have been changed to Le'olam, which is much more common as an adverbial than Olam. On the other hand, if Avalim, evildoers, was first misread as Le'olam, forever, as possibly in 4Q171, then it would be quite easy to misread Nishmadu, they will be destroyed, as Nishmaru, they will be protected, since one would naturally assume that the pious of verse 28, 8-b, was still the topic or subject in verse 28c. This makes for a strong cumulative case for the reading of Alim Nishmadu. The difficulty with this text mainly relates to details of the text and translation technique of the Septuagint translator on which it is based. The Greek manuscript tradition is divided. Most Greek manuscripts read anomoi de ekdiothesontai, but the lawless shall be chased away, according to Netz, which Ralphs and Pietersma treat as the Old Greek reading. But the Codices Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, probably Ralphs 2110, and other Egyptian witnesses read amomoi ekdikethesontai, the blameless will be vindicated. Given the graphic similarity between the two Greek readings and the difficulty of tracing amomoi ekdikethesontai back to a different Hebrew text, it seems that anomoi de ekdiothesontai should indeed be accepted as the Old Greek reading. Some have also questioned whether this Greek reading indeed goes back to the proposed Hebrew text. The word ekdioko, I chase away, is never elsewhere used to render the root shamad in the Psalter, which is everywhere else rendered with exolethruo, I destroy. Thus, some have suggested that the Greek may rather have read nitzmatu, they will be destroyed, which is twice translated with ekdioko in the Psalter in Psalms 69:5 and 101:5. While this is possible, these two examples are not enough to establish this case. The roots shamad and tzamat are closely synonymous, and the Greek translator is characteristically free with the translation of synonyms. In fact, tzamat is even more frequently translated with exolethruo, just like shamad. Variations of synonyms is especially probable in this example in verse 28, since this was the first example of shamad the translator encountered in the Psalter. It's possible that he just had not yet settled on a typical equivalent. The characteristic of the translator to vary the renderings of synonyms makes it unnecessary to suppose a different Hebrew text like nitzmatu. So the Greek seems to provide strong support for our preferred reading of Alim Nishmadu. Thus, we prefer to read verse 28c as Avalim Nishmadu, with the meaning wrongdoers will be destroyed, similar to the BDS. This reading is graphically very similar to and easily explains the MT reading. It's supported by our oldest witnesses, makes good sense in the context, and restores the expected poetic structure of the psalm. This version of verse 28c marks the beginning of the Ein section in the psalm, which now consists of two lines describing the fate of the wicked, verse 28c to d, contrasted with two lines describing the hope of the righteous, verse 29. It also nicely parallels the use of the same set of verbs in verse 38 for the fate of sinners. We would rate our confidence in this reading as a C+. The third issue in Psalm 37 is the text and meaning of verse 35b. In verse 35a, the psalmist states that he has seen someone who is wicked and ruthless, and verse 35b further describes this wicked person. This description is translated quite differently in modern translations, as can be seen in the following examples. Flourishing like a luxuriant native tree, NIV. Well-rooted like a robust native tree, NJPS. Spreading himself like a green laurel tree, ESV. and towering like a cedar of Lebanon, NRSV. The difficulties in translation can be broken down into two distinct but interrelated problems. The first problem to address is the meaning of the last two words of the verse. The Masoretic text reads, Ke'ezrach ra'anam, like a flourishing native. The word Ezrach has the common meaning native inhabitant, citizen of Israel, as opposed to sojourner, according to DCH. Since the adjective ra'anan, or luxuriant or fresh, usually describes trees, interpreters have generally assumed that the native in this verse is a tree, as in, like a luxuriant native tree in the NIV, or a tree in its native soil, according to the NLT. This understanding is also reflected in several ancient translations, including Aquila, Symmachus, the Sexta from Origen's Hexapla, and Jerome's translation from the Hebrew. The sense would then be that the wicked person is like a tree that's flourishing in its native habitat, where it's particularly resilient and well-suited to grow. The difficulty with this interpretation is that the term native is never elsewhere used in this way in the Hebrew Bible. The word Ezrach is only ever used in other passages with reference to human beings, so it's not clear whether ancient speakers of classical Hebrew ever applied this concept to trees, or whether that is a more modern conceptual framework. This difficulty may be somewhat mitigated if we suppose that the expression is a metaphorical extension of the basic meaning, picturing a person as a tree, so SDBH. An alternative possibility presents itself when we consider the Septuagint translation of the Psalms. The Old Greek translation reads, Hos tas kedrus tu Libanu, like the cedars of Lebanon, a reading which is followed by some modern translations. This probably corresponds to the underlying Hebrew Ke'arze Levanon, which not coincidentally looks very similar to the MT's Ke'ezrach ra'anan. The similarity suggests that a scribe may have confused these two words at some point in the tradition. The question is, which reading came first? The reading the cedars of Lebanon is a common expression in the Hebrew Bible which suggests that a scribe would be more likely to change the difficult MT text to read the easier cedars of Lebanon. Yet it is risky to apply the text critical principle of preferring the more difficult reading in cases where a scribe may have accidentally confused readings, since scribal errors often create textual difficulties. In this case, however, a change from cedars of Lebanon to flourishing native tree is much more difficult to explain, since it would involve the misreading of multiple letters and the resulting text would still make good sense in context. Thus, it appears likely that the Septuagint translator or an early Hebrew copyist did not understand the Hebrew flourishing native tree, and so amended the text to a more common expression that looked similar to the received text and also made good sense in the context. So we read here, like a flourishing native tree. The second major problem in this verse regards the meaning of the participle that describes how the wicked person is like a flourishing native tree, which in the MT is mitareh. There are four main interpretations, namely exposing himself, spreading himself out, well-rooted, and ascending. The participle mitareh comes from a root that normally means to expose oneself, which in this context could refer to openly doing evil in public. The medieval Jewish commentator Ibn Ezra, for example, paraphrases the verse like this: I have seen the wicked powerful like a many-branched tree, doing all sorts of wicked acts in public. While this proposed meaning fits the context as a characterization of the wicked, it does not make sense of the imagery in the verse. The idea of exposing oneself involves stripping oneself bare, the exact opposite of the image of a flourishing tree with rich foliage. Other interpreters translate mitareh with the sense of spreading oneself out, like the ESV, spreading himself like a green laurel tree. On this interpretation, the tree is thriving and spreading out its branches and/or roots. The translation, spreading its branches out, makes good sense in the context, but there's no real lexical justification for translating it in this way. The word never occurs elsewhere with this meaning, so it's doubtful here. A third option is to understand mitareh to mean well-rooted, as did the medieval Jewish commentator Rashi. The NJPS translation, for example, reads, I saw a wicked man, powerful, well-rooted like a robust native tree. This view also makes good sense in the context, since a well-rooted tree is resilient and not easily moved, which makes the disappearance of the wicked in the next verse, verse 36, especially surprising. The Mishnaic tractate Oktzin 3.8 uses the root to refer to a plant's rootedness in the ground when it says, grain that had been uprooted but is still attached, me'orah, to the soil, even by the smallest of roots, is not susceptible to uncleanness. This meaning, however, is a late development in the Hebrew language and is not attested elsewhere in classical Hebrew. A fourth possible interpretation seems rather more likely. The participle could mean ascending or rising as in SDBH. The NRSV, for example, says towering like a cedar of Lebanon. This reading evidently fits the context well. The NRSV derives its meaning from the Greek kai eperomenon hos tas kedrus tu Libanu, and being raised up like the cedars of Lebanon, which, along with the Syriac Peshitta, seems to be reading the participle as mit'aleh instead of the empty mit'areh. There's also an alternative explanation that arrives at the same translation, namely that the MT mit'areh could be a phonological or dialectical variant of mit'aleh, as suggested in a Net Bible translation note. The phonetic interchange of lamed and resh is documented elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. In Isaiah 13:22a, almanotav occurs for the expected armanotav. In Job 6:16b, we find yit alem instead of the expected yit arem. And in Job 6:25a, nimretsu is written for the expected nimletsu. In each of these examples, scholars have proposed that the reason for the interchange may be poetic artistry, since the substituted letters create alliterative patterns. The same could be true in Psalm 37:35b as well. In verses 34 to 36, there's a prominent alliterative sequence of 15 consecutive words, each of which has a resh. Kaveh el Adonai, ushmor darko, viromimcha lareshet aret, hikaret rasha'im tir'eh, ra'iti rasha aritz, umit'areh ka'ezrach ra'anan, vaya'avor vehine enenu, va'avakashehu velo nimtza. The repetition of the letter resh reminds the listener of the presence of the wicked, rasha, and the pattern stops abruptly with the disappearance of the wicked, indicated by the phrase vehine enenu, and look, he was no more. Thus, we prefer to read the MT mit'areh as a phonological variant of mit'aleh, with the meaning of ascending. In Psalm 37:35b, we retain the MT reading umit'areh ka'ezrach ra'anan, and render it, and he was ascending like a green native tree. The sense is that trees growing in their native climate and in their native soil grow very well and are resilient. Similarly, the wicked person in verse 35 appears to be flourishing, and we would not expect him or her to disappear. Thus, the psalmist is very surprised in verse 36, saying, I passed by, and get this, he was gone. Then I looked for him, and he was not found. We would rate our confidence in this reading as a C. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 37:20, we understand the phrase kikar karim similarly to the ESV, which says, the enemies of the Lord are like the glory of the pastures. The picture is that the wicked are like beautiful flowers that grace the pastures, but are quickly blown away by the wind. The use of similar imagery from nature is found elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible and permeates Psalm 37, as does the theme of the transience of the wicked. In verse 28c, we read the Hebrew phrase avalim nishmadu with the meaning wrongdoers will be destroyed, similar to the BDS. This reading nicely restores the likely original poetic structure of the psalm. It makes the Ein section begin with the expected Ein. It also means that verse 28c to d consists of two lines about the fate of the wicked, while the second verse of the section contrasts with two lines about the hope of the righteous. This reading also makes the parallel with verse 38 even clearer, since the verses share both verbs. In verse 35b, we retain the MT reading, Umit'arek ezrach ra'anan, and interpret it in the sense of, and he was ascending like a green native tree. This supposes that mit'areh was a phonetic variant for mit'aleh, which has been used in this case to produce an alliterative sequence of 15 consecutive words that all include the letter resh. The repeated resh sound reminds the listener of the presence of the wicked person, Rasha, who suddenly and unexpectedly disappears at the point where the alliteration stops. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 37, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm and explores the beauty of the psalm as a poem. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.org and learn more.